People think betrayal arrives loudly, a crashing wave or a shattering glass. It doesn't. It arrives with receipts, tucked neatly into a leather folio, or perhaps as the faint metallic click of a high-end luggage lock being engaged when someone thinks you're in the shower. I've spent my entire career in risk management. I look at spreadsheets and see the architecture of failure before it happens. I look at a bullish market and find the stress fractures. I should have looked at my marriage the same way, but I suppose even the most disciplined analyst wants to believe his own home is a AAA rated asset. The villa was my idea, though Miriam, my mother-in-law, had spent the better part of 6 months claiming she'd scouted it. It sat on a jagged limestone tooth overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea, a sprawling Amalfi masterpiece of white stucco and blue tile that cost more for a 10-day stay than most people in the village below earned in a decade. I paid for it. I paid for the private chef who arrived at dawn to knead sourdough, the car service that shuttled us from Naples in silent, leather-scented Mercedes, and the endless crates of vintage Bulgari that Miriam drank like it was tap water. "The Wi-Fi is spotty in the East Wing, Garrett," Miriam said, not looking up from her tablet as I stepped onto the terrace for breakfast. She was wrapped in a silk caftan that probably cost as much as a mid-sized sedan, her face a mask of expensive serums and practiced dissatisfaction. "I'm trying to coordinate the charity auction back in Greenwich. It's a bit difficult when the infrastructure is rustic." "It's a cliffside villa built in the 1920s, Miriam," I said, pulling out a heavy iron chair. The screech of metal against stone was intentional. "I'll see if I can move the router closer to your suite, or you could enjoy the view. It's literally why we're here." She offered a thin, pitying smile. "We're here because we're a family, Garrett. Although I do wonder if you picked this place specifically because it's so isolated. It's almost claustrophobic, isn't it?" I looked at her. Miriam Clarke was a woman who navigated social circles like a shark in a lagoon. She didn't have a career, she had a presence. Beside her, my father-in-law, Elliot, was hunched over a plate of figs, his eyes darting toward me with a strange, nervous energy before returning to his fruit. He was a man who had spent 40 years being told what to think, and it showed in the slump of his shoulders. "Isolation is a luxury," I replied, pouring myself a coffee. "It keeps the noise out." Paige stepped onto the terrace then, looking radiant in a white linen dress. She leaned down and kissed my cheek, a dry, perfunctory gesture that felt more like a social obligation than an act of affection. She smelled of expensive sunscreen and something else, something sharp and clinical. "Sleep well?" she asked, though she was already reaching for her phone. "I stayed up late reviewing the quarterly reports," I said. It was a lie. I had stayed up late watching the cloud-synced feed from the small, discrete sensors I'd installed in the villa's common areas and my own private office space. It's a habit from the office. When you control millions of dollars of other people's capital, you learn that trust is a variable, not a constant. "Always working," Miriam sighed. "It's a wonder you have time for a vacation at all. Or a wife. You know, Paige was telling me how quiet the house has been lately. Almost like you're already gone before you even leave for the city." "I provide a certain standard of living, Miriam. That requires focus." "And what a standard it is," she said, waving a hand toward the infinity pool. "But money doesn't buy character, does it? It just provides a larger stage for one's flaws." The barbs were getting sharper. Usually Miriam kept her disdain under a layer of passive-aggressive politeness, but something about the Italian air had made her bold, or perhaps it was the plan. I watched Paige's reflection in the glass of the sliding door. She wasn't eating. She was watching her mother, waiting for a cue. My own parents sat at the far end of the long table, looking like they wanted to vanish into the masonry. They were simple people. My father was a retired civil engineer, my mother a librarian. I had brought them here to share in my success, to give them a taste of the life I'd built, but they were clearly out of their depth in the face of the Clarks' theatrical entitlement. "Is something wrong, Mom?" I asked. She looked up, startled. "Oh no, Garrett. It's a lot. All this. It feels a bit much, doesn't it?" "It's perfect," Paige intervened, her voice smooth and practiced. "Garrett just likes to show off a little. Don't you, honey? He wants everyone to know he's the one holding the checkbook." I felt the first stirrings of that familiar, cold clarity, the one I get right before a market crash. It's a tightening in the chest, a sharpening of the senses. I wasn't angry, I was analytical. I began to tally the small inconsistencies of the last 48 hours. Paige's missing laptop, the one she claimed she'd lost at the airport, but which I'd seen her tucking into Miriam's suitcase through a half-open door. The way Elliot wouldn't meet my eyes, the way the staff looked at me with a mixture of pity and confusion. "If I didn't hold the checkbook, we'd be at a Holiday Inn in Scranton," I said, my voice flat. Miriam stiffened. "There it is. The arrogance. You think because you've had a few good years in the city, you're untouchable. But reputations are fragile, Garrett. They're built on more than just a bank balance. I'm well aware of how fragile things are, I said. That's why I insure everything. The afternoon took on a surreal, heavy quality. We went for a walk through the terraced gardens, a winding path of lemon trees and rosemary that should have been idyllic. Instead, it felt like a procession. Miriam led the way, holding court on the importance of legacy and integrity, her voice carrying across the limestone walls. Paige walked beside her, whispering in hushed tones, their heads bent together in a way that suggested a shared secret. I lagged behind with Elliot. He was sweating despite the breeze. You okay, Elliot? You seem jumpy. He wiped his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. It's the heat, Garrett, and the height. I've never liked being this close to the edge. Then don't look down, I said. Focus on where you're stepping. Most people trip because they're looking at the horizon instead of their own feet. He looked at me then, a flash of genuine fear in his eyes. You think you've thought of everything, don't you? You think you can just calculate your way out of any situation. It hasn't failed me yet. We reached a scenic overlook, a stone platform guarded by a low wall. The drop was hundreds of feet of sheer rock ending in the churning turquoise of the sea. Miriam turned around, her face illuminated by the harsh Mediterranean sun. She looked triumphant. You know, Garrett, she said, her voice projecting as if she were addressing a boardroom. I was looking for my vintage sapphire brooch this morning, the one that's been in our family for 3 generations. I can't seem to find it anywhere. I leaned against the stone wall, crossing my arms. Did you check your jewelry roll? I checked everywhere. It's gone. Along with several other pieces of my jewelry. It's quite distressing, especially considering we're in a locked villa with only family and a few staff members who have impeccable references. Paige stepped forward, her hand on her mother's arm. Mom, let's not do this now. I'm sure it'll turn up. No, Paige, it's a matter of principle, Miriam snapped. Things don't just vanish. People take them. People who feel entitled to things they didn't earn, or people who are in over their heads and need a quick influx of liquidity. I felt the trap snapping shut. It was clumsy, really. A bit cliché. The missing jewelry, the subtle hints at financial instability, the public accusation masked as concern. They were setting the stage for a narrative. In the world of high finance, a rumor of desperation is often as damaging as the reality. If Miriam started telling her social circle that her son-in-law was struggling and erratic, my investors would start making phone calls. Are you suggesting something, Miriam? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. She stepped closer, her eyes cold. I'm saying that if anything goes missing, we'll know who did it. We'll know who was desperate enough to violate the sanctity of this family for a bit of gold. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the sound of the wind whipping off the water. My parents looked horrified. Paige looked away. Miriam stood her ground, a smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. She thought she was the predator. She thought she had me cornered on a cliffside in Italy, miles from my support system, surrounded by people she had turned against me. She didn't realize that I'd been recording the entire conversation through the high-gain microphone hidden in my watch. She didn't realize that the spotty Wi-Fi was actually a result of me rerouting the villa's entire network through a private, encrypted server I controlled. And she certainly didn't realize that I had already seen the missing brooch. It wasn't stolen. It was currently sitting in the bottom of my mother's handbag, where Paige had planted it an hour before breakfast. I think it's time we head back, I said, my expression unreadable. The sun is starting to get a bit too intense. People start seeing things that aren't there when they're overheated. As we walked back toward the villa, I felt a strange sense of peace. The ambiguity was gone. The market had declared its direction. Now, it was simply a matter of executing the trade. They wanted to play a game of reputations and shadows? Fine. I'd spent 15 years mastering that game. I'd paid for this paradise. I'd paid for every lemon tree, every bottle of wine, and every moment of their carefully choreographed betrayal. And before the week was over, I was going to make sure they understood exactly what the closing costs were. I caught Paige watching me, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. She knew me well enough to know that I was too calm. She expected a defense, an argument, a frantic search for the missing items. My silence was a variable she hadn't accounted for in her plan. Garrett, she whispered as we entered the cool shade of the villa's atrium. Are you okay? I smiled at her, a genuine chilling smile that didn't reach my eyes. I'm fine, Paige. I'm just thinking about the ROI on this trip. I think it's going to be much higher than I anticipated. I left them in the foyer and headed toward my study. I had footage to review, accounts to move, and a very specific set of instructions to send to my legal team in New York. The Clarks thought they were burying me. They just didn't realize I'd already mapped out the entire cemetery. The study in the villa was a vaulted room lined with dark walnut and smelling faintly of beeswax and old paper. It was the only room I had forbidden the housekeeping staff from entering without my presence. I sat at the heavy desk, the cool air from the stone walls a welcome relief from the stifling humidity of the terrace. On the mahogany surface, my laptop glowed, a sleek silver window into a reality far removed from the dramatic posturing of the Clarke family. I hadn't just rerouted the Wi-Fi, I had built a digital perimeter. In my world, information is the only currency that doesn't devalue under pressure, and right now, I was the wealthiest man in the building. I opened the folder labeled Villa Secure. It was populated with hours of footage from the discreet lenses I'd placed in the common areas, small, high-definition pinholes hidden within the ornate moldings and the shadows of the bookshelves. I didn't feel a shred of guilt. When you manage a hedge fund, you learn that the people most vocal about transparency are usually the ones with the most to hide. I scrubbed through the timeline from earlier that morning. There they were, Paige and Miriam. They were in the library, a room they assumed was empty. The audio was crisp, thanks to the acoustic properties of the marble floors. Miriam was pacing, her caftan billowing like a sail. Paige was sitting on the edge of a velvet chaise, her hands folded in her lap, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. "The timing has to be precise, Paige." Miriam's voice came through my speakers, sharp and brittle. "We can't have him suspecting a coordinated effort. It has to look like a spontaneous discovery of his instability." "He's not unstable, Mom," Paige said, though her voice lacked conviction. "He's just focused. If we push too hard, he'll lock down. You know how he is when he's under pressure. He becomes a machine." "Machines can be broken," Miriam countered, "especially when their reputation is at stake. Once the accusation is made publicly, his investors will panic. They're a skittish lot, those men. They want stability. If we show them a man who is erratic, a man who is taking family heirlooms because he's over-leveraged, they'll pull their capital. And when the fund collapses, the prenuptial agreement becomes a moot point. We'll be the victims of his financial ruin. The narrative will be about the poor, blindsided wife and her aging parents left in the lurch by a reckless gambler." I watched Paige nod slowly. It wasn't the nod of a woman being coerced. It was the nod of a partner in a merger. She was calculating the payout. I felt a strange, cold admiration for the scope of their plan. They weren't just looking for a divorce. They were looking for a liquidation. They wanted to strip mine my life and leave the remains in the sun to bleach. I closed the laptop for a moment and leaned back, looking out at the gardens. I recalled the lost laptop incident from 3 months ago. I had spent a week helping Paige search for it, watching her tearful frustration as she claimed her latest manuscript, the one she'd worked on for a year, was gone forever. I had been sympathetic. I had bought her a top-of-the-line replacement and paid for a high-end data recovery service that, predictably, found nothing. Now I knew why. The laptop hadn't been lost. It had been the first test of my reactions, a dry run to see how easily I could be manipulated by a sense of loss. The door to the study creaked open. It was my mother. She looked pale, her eyes darting to the corners of the room as if she expected the walls to speak. She was still clutching her handbag, the one that currently contained Miriam's missing sapphire brooch. "Garrett," she whispered, "can I talk to you?" "Of course, Mom. Sit down." She sat on the edge of a leather chair, her knuckles white as she gripped the straps of her purse. "There's something... I feel very uncomfortable, Garrett. Miriam has been saying things. About your work, about how you've been acting lately. She told me that you've been having episodes of forgetfulness, that you're under so much pressure you're not yourself. And do you believe her?" "No," she said firmly, though her voice wavered. "But she's very convincing. She makes it sound like she's worried about you, and Paige. Paige just stands there and cries. It's like they're trying to wrap me in a fog. And then, an hour ago, I found this in my bag." She reached in and pulled out the brooch. It was a stunning piece, a deep, oceanic blue sapphire surrounded by a constellation of diamonds. It looked heavy, expensive, and entirely like a trap. "I didn't put it there, Garrett. I would never... I don't even like sapphires." "I know you didn't, Mom," I said, my voice softening. "Paige put it there. She did it while you were in the kitchen asking the chef about the lemon cake. I saw it on the feed." My mother froze. "The feed?" "I have cameras, Mom, in the common areas, for security." She looked around the room, a mix of relief and horror on her face. "You saw her? You saw your own wife frame your mother for theft?" "I did, and I've already backed up the footage to 3 different off-site servers." "Then why aren't you saying anything? Why are we sitting here while they treat us like criminals? Because in risk management, you don't move until you see the entire board, I explained. If I reveal what I know now, they'll just pivot. They'll claim I'm a paranoid spy, that I've created a hostile environment. They'll use the cameras as proof of my mental decline. I need them to commit fully to their play. I need them to make the accusation in front of witnesses they can't retract. But Garrett, they're calling the local authorities. Miriam was on the phone with a cousin of hers who knows the police chief in the village. They're planning something for tonight. A dinner. They've invited the Contessa from the villa next door and several other local dignitaries. They want a crowd. Good, I said. A crowd makes for a better closing. Don't worry about the brooch, Mom. Put it back in your bag. Stay calm. Act a little confused, a little nervous. That won't be hard for you right now. Just trust me. She looked at me, and for a second I saw her wonder if Miriam was right, if I had become something cold and unrecognizable. But then she nodded, tucked the brooch back into the silk lining of her purse, and left the room without another word. I turned back to the screen. I needed to look at the financial side. I accessed the joint accounts I shared with Paige. Over the last 6 months, there had been a series of small, seemingly innocuous withdrawals. $5,000 here, $10,000 there, all labeled as research expenses or charity donations. They added up to nearly $300,000. It was a drop in the bucket compared to my total net worth, but it was the intent that mattered. She was building a war chest. Then I found the real prize, a hidden sub-account under a shell company named Azzurro Holdings. It was a name I recognized from a contract I'd seen on Elliot's desk weeks ago. The account held a significant balance, but more importantly, it was linked to a series of wire transfers from a rival hedge fund manager, a man named Marcus Thorne who had been trying to headhunt my top analysts for years. The pieces clicked together with the satisfying sound of a heavy vault door locking. This wasn't just a family grievance or a play for an inheritance. This was corporate espionage. Thorne was paying the Clarkes to provide the internal instability required to trigger the key man clauses in my investor contracts. If I was declared mentally unfit or embroiled in a criminal investigation for theft or fraud, my investors had the right to withdraw their capital immediately without penalty. Thorne would be waiting to catch them on the rebound. Paige hadn't just betrayed her husband, she had sold out the firm. I felt a surge of adrenaline, but I kept it under a tight lid. This was no longer about a vacation or a brooch. This was an assassination attempt on my career. I began to type, my fingers flying across the keys as I drafted a series of commands. I revoked the corporate credit cards linked to the Clarkes' names. I put a freeze on the joint accounts, citing potential fraudulent activity. I contacted my head of security in New York and told him to secure the physical files in my office and change the biometric locks. Then, I went to the villa's booking site. I had paid for the entire stay in advance, but the contract had a clause regarding unforeseen circumstances and conduct of guests. I sent a short, encrypted message to the property management company. By the time I finished, the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, painting the limestone cliffs in shades of bruised purple and gold. The villa felt different now, less like a luxury retreat and more like a tactical environment. I could hear the sounds of preparation from the kitchen, the clinking of silverware, the popping of corks. The stage was being set. I stood up and went to the mirror. I straightened my linen blazer and smoothed my hair. I looked like a man on vacation. I looked like a man who didn't have a care in the world. I practiced a look of slight, weary confusion, the expression of a husband who knows something is wrong but can't quite put his finger on it. Downstairs, I could hear Miriam's voice, loud and performative, greeting the first of the evening's guests. She was in her element, weaving a web of lies with the skill of a master weaver. I checked my watch. The countdown had begun. As I walked down the grand staircase, I saw Paige standing by the tall windows. She was looking out at the sea, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked beautiful, and for a fleeting second, I remembered why I had married her. I remembered the way we used to talk about the future, about building something that lasted. But that man, the man who believed in those things, was gone. He'd been replaced by the man who had seen the receipts. "Ready for dinner?" I asked, stepping up behind her. She jumped slightly, some of her wine splashing onto the stone floor. "Garrett, you startled me." "Sorry, you seemed miles away." "I was just thinking about how lucky we are," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "To be here, together?" "Yes," I said, looking her straight in the eye. "We're very lucky. Everything is exactly where it's supposed to be." She looked away first. The evening was about to begin. The guests were arriving, the accusations were polished, and the trap was set. But as I followed my wife into the dining room, I knew something they didn't. I wasn't the one walking into the cage. I was the one who had built it. The dining room was a theater of excess. lit by a massive iron chandelier that cast flickering amber shadows against the frescoed ceiling. The table was a long expanse of reclaimed oak, set with heavy silverware and crystal that sang whenever a sleeve brushed against it. Miriam had curated the guest list with the precision of a jeweler. There was the Contessa, a woman whose family had owned half the coastline since the Renaissance, a local magistrate with a penchant for expensive scotch, and a handful of socialites who existed primarily to carry news from one villa to the next. They were the perfect amplifiers for the performance Miriam was about to give. I sat at the head of the table, the dutiful host, pouring wine and offering observations on the local architecture. I was a model of restraint. Across from me, Paige was a portrait of fraying nerves. She kept adjusting her necklace, a simple gold chain, her more elaborate pieces having been mysteriously put away for safekeeping. Miriam, however, was in peak form. She sat to my right, her voice a melodic trill as she steered the conversation toward the vulnerability of modern wealth. "It's a different world now, isn't it, Contessa?" Miriam asked, leaning forward so the light caught the calculated concern in her eyes. "One day you have everything, and the next, the pressures of the market, the sheer weight of maintaining such a facade. It causes people to snap. They do things they never thought themselves capable of." The Contessa nodded sagely. "The higher the climb, the more treacherous the footing." "Exactly," Miriam said, her gaze drifting toward me. "Garrett knows all about that. He lives in that world of high stakes. I often wonder how he manages to keep it all together, especially lately. He's been so preoccupied. Haven't you, dear?" "I'm an analyst, Miriam," I said, my voice steady. "Preoccupation is my baseline. If I'm not thinking 3 steps ahead, I'm not doing my job." "But at what cost?" Miriam sighed, turning back to the table. "When the mind is so focused on numbers, it loses its grip on reality. Things start to go missing. Not just money, but memories, integrity. One starts to feel entitled to things that don't belong to them, simply to fill the holes left by the pressure." The table went quiet. It was the opening gambit. I could see my father-in-law, Elliot, staring intently at his sea bass, his fork trembling. My own parents were statues of localized misery. They knew the blow was coming. They just didn't know where it would land. "Is something the matter, Miriam?" the magistrate asked, his interest piqued. "You sound as though you are speaking from a specific experience." Miriam looked at Paige, who gave a sharp, rehearsed nod. Then Miriam looked at me, her expression shifting from feigned concern to a cold, righteous fury. "It's a tragedy, really. I noticed today that several of my family heirlooms, pieces of immense sentimental and financial value, have disappeared from my suite. And I'm afraid I'm not the only one. Paige has noticed discrepancies in their personal accounts back home. Large sums, moved without her knowledge." The air in the room seemed to vanish. The Contessa set her glass down with a soft clack. "Miriam," I said, leaning back, "this isn't the time or the place." "When is the time, Garrett? When we're back in the States and you've hidden the evidence? When my daughter is left with nothing because you've gambled it all away on some offshore whim?" Miriam stood up, her voice rising to reach the staff hovering in the doorway. "I've already contacted the local carabinieri. They're on their way. I couldn't in good conscience let this go. Not when I suspect the person responsible is sitting right here." She pointed a trembling finger at me. "He's been acting erratically for months. He's obsessed with surveillance, with control. I believe he's taken the jewelry to cover losses we don't even know about yet. It's a classic case of a man losing his grip." Paige began to sob, a soft, delicate sound that was perfectly pitched for the room. "I didn't want to believe it, Garrett. I tried to cover for you. But the money, the way you've been watching us, I'm scared." It was a masterclass in social execution. In one move, they had labeled me a thief, a failed businessman, and a psychological threat. The magistrate looked at me with professional detachment, already calculating the legal ramifications. The socialites were already composing the texts they would send the moment they left the gates. "You called the police?" I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. "I had to," Miriam said, "for Paige's protection and for the sake of the family legacy." As if on cue, the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall opened. 2 officers in crisp uniforms entered, led by a captain who looked far too dignified for a simple theft report. They approached the table, their hats tucked under their arms. "There has been a report of a theft?" the captain asked, his English accented but precise. "Yes," Miriam said, stepping forward. "I am Miriam Clarke. My daughter and I believe my son-in-law, Garrett Hale, has taken several high-value items. We also have reason to believe he is mentally unstable and may be a risk to himself or others." The captain looked at me. I didn't move. I didn't protest. I simply took a sip of my wine. "Mr. Hale?" the captain asked. "Do you have anything to say?" I have a great deal to say, I replied, but I'd prefer to do it with a bit more context. Miriam, you mentioned that you're worried about my obsession with surveillance. You're right. I am obsessed. It's a requirement of my profession. Because I'm so obsessed, I've had the villa's security system upgraded at my own expense. I pulled a tablet from the side table and tapped the screen. The large television mounted on the far wall, usually used for displaying art, flickered to life. It showed a grid of 6 camera feeds. What is this? Miriam hissed. This is a violation of privacy. This is the truth, I said. Captain, if you would be so kind as to look at the screen. I swiped the tablet, and one of the feeds expanded to fill the screen. It was a high-angle shot of the kitchen area from 3 hours ago. The timestamp was clear. On the screen, my mother was standing by the counter, talking to the chef. Paige entered the frame from the side. She was holding something small and glittering. With a quick, practiced motion, she slipped the object into the open side pocket of my mother's handbag, which was resting on a stool. The room went silent. Paige's sobbing stopped instantly. That looks like your sapphire brooch, Miriam, I said. The one you were so distressed about. It seems your daughter found a very creative place to store it. I swiped again. The next video showed Miriam and Paige in the library. The audio was clear, the speakers in the room broadcasting their conversation about breaking the machine and the keyman clauses. The mention of Marcus Thorne and the rival firm, Azzurro Holdings, hung in the air like a poisonous fog. The magistrate's expression shifted from curiosity to profound distaste. The Contessa looked as though she had just discovered a cockroach in her vintage champagne. This is a fabrication, Miriam shouted, though her face had turned a sickly shade of gray. He's a tech expert. He's manipulated the footage. It's a live-synced cloud feed with a blockchain timestamp, Miriam, I said. It's impossible to manipulate, and I've already sent the full unedited files to the captain's precinct, as well as to my legal team in New York, along with the records of the wire transfers from Marcus Thorne to your husband's shell company. Elliot made a soft, choking sound and slumped in his chair. The captain turned to Paige. Mrs. Hale, would you care to explain why you were placing jewelry in your mother-in-law's bag? Paige looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and realization. The supportive, artistic persona had vanished, replaced by the panicked look of an investor caught in a margin call. Garrett, please. We were just trying to get your attention. You've been so distant. We thought if we created a crisis, you'd finally see us. I see you now, I said. I see everything. I turned to the captain. I'm not filing charges for the theft attempt tonight. Not yet. I'm more interested in the conspiracy to commit fraud and the breach of fiduciary duty. But as for the villa, I am the sole signatory on the lease, and according to the conduct clause, I have the right to remove any guests who create a hostile or illegal environment. I stood up. I was a foot taller than Miriam, and for the first time in years, I let the full weight of my presence fill the room. I wasn't the provider anymore. I wasn't the AAA asset they could liquidate. Miriam, Elliot, Paige, you have 20 minutes to pack your things. The car service I hired has been canceled. You'll find that your corporate cards have also been deactivated. There is a very lovely hostel in the village. I suggest you start walking before the sun goes down completely. You can't do this, Miriam shrieked. We're family. Family is a partnership based on mutual interest and trust, I said. You've defaulted on your obligations. The contract is void. The guests were already making their exits, scurrying away from the blast zone of the Clarks' social destruction. The magistrate paused by the captain, whispering something in Italian that didn't sound particularly helpful for Miriam's future. Paige moved toward me, her hands reaching out. Garrett, honey, let's talk about this privately. We can fix this. The fixing is done, Paige. I ran the numbers. You're a liability I can no longer afford. The officers stepped in then, politely but firmly guiding them toward the stairs. My parents remained at the table, looking stunned. My mother reached into her bag, pulled out the brooch, and set it on the table like it was a piece of hot coal. I sat back down and picked up my fork. The sea base was cold, but I didn't mind. I had never felt more focused. The first phase was over. They were exposed, humiliated, and financially cut off in a foreign country. But I knew Miriam. She wouldn't go quietly to a hostel. She would try to strike back. She would try to use the only thing she had left, the narrative. But I had already rewritten the ending. Eat your dinner, Mom, I said gently. The view is much better now that the noise has been cleared out. I looked out the window at the lights of the village below. The hunt was far from over, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being tracked. The exodus was not quiet. In my experience, people who have lived their lives behind a facade of dignified wealth rarely transition into shame with any measure of grace. They tend to exit with a screeching of tires and a frantic grasping at the scenery. As the local officers stood by the grand foyer, their presence a silent, rhythmic ticking of a clock, the Clarke family began to dismantle. Miriam's voice echoed through the marble hallways, a jagged, discordant sound that stripped away the last of the Amalfi Coast's curated tranquility. She wasn't just shouting, she was attempting to litigate her way out of a burning building. "This is a kidnapping? You are trapping us in a foreign jurisdiction," she yelled, her silk scarf trailing behind her as she lunged toward the luggage Paige was frantically dragging toward the door. Miriam turned her venom toward the police captain, who remained as impassive as a statue in the village square. "Do you know who my husband is? Do you know the connections we have in the consulate?" The captain didn't even blink. He had seen the footage. In a culture that prizes family and honor, the sight of a daughter framing an elderly mother-in-law for a crime was a special kind of stain. He gestured toward the driveway, where the moon was beginning to cast long, skeletal shadows across the gravel. "The gentleman is the owner of the lease," the captain said, his voice a low rumble. "He has requested your departure. In this country, the law of the house is very clear. You will go now, or you will be escorted to the station for a more formal processing regarding the brooch." The word station seemed to deflate Miriam momentarily. The prospect of a night on a wooden bench in a humid holding cell was a reality that her silk caftans weren't designed to withstand. She turned back to me, her face a contorted mask of hatred. I was standing at the top of the stairs, looking down at the wreckage. I felt like an architect observing a controlled demolition. There is a certain satisfaction in seeing the physics of a plan work exactly as intended. "You think you've won, Garrett?" she hissed, her voice dropping to a low, trembling vibration. "You've just ensured your own ruin. When we get back, I will tell everyone that you planted those cameras for voyeurism. I will tell the board that you are a predator who films his own family. We will strip you of every cent you ever earned. You'll be a pariah." "Miriam," I said, leaning casually against the banister, "you're still thinking in the old paradigm. You think this is a gossip column. I've already sent the encrypted files to the compliance officer at Marcus Thorne's firm. I've also sent a courtesy copy to the regulatory bodies overseeing the Azzurro Holdings shell company. By the time you reach the bottom of the hill, Marcus Thorne will be busy erasing your husband's name from his digital life to save his own license. You aren't a partner anymore. You're a liability that's already been written off." Elliot, who had been standing by the door clutching a briefcase like a life raft, finally spoke. His voice was thin and reedy. "Garrett, please. I have debts. You know about the venture in the Caymans. If the wire transfers are flagged, they'll freeze everything." "You should have thought about the risk profile before you decided to play against your own son-in-law," I replied. "You took a short position on my life, Elliot. The market moved against you. Now you're getting a margin call." Paige stopped her frantic packing. She looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed, her face pale. She looked like the woman I had married, yet she was a stranger. It was a strange psychological phenomenon, to see the physical shell of someone you cared for and realize there was nothing behind it but a balance sheet. "Is that all I am to you now?" she asked, her voice cracking. "A bad investment?" "You were a partner who engaged in insider trading against the firm," I said. "In my world, there is no emotional recovery from that. There is only the settlement." "I'm your wife," she screamed, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You were my wife when you were planting jewelry in my mother's bag. You were my wife when you were taking kickbacks from Thorne to destabilize my fund. You don't get to invoke the sanctity of the contract after you've spent 6 months burning it." I turned to my parents, who were standing in the shadows of the dining room door. My father's face was set in a hard line of disappointment, but my mother was trembling. I walked down the stairs and put a hand on her shoulder. "Go to your room, Mom. Lock the door. I've arranged for a separate car to take you and Dad to a hotel in Sorrento in the morning. You shouldn't have to see the rest of this." "Garrett," she whispered, "this isn't you. This is so hard." "It's necessary," I said. "If you don't cut out the rot, it spreads." They retreated into the house, leaving me alone with the Clarkes and the police. The finality of the moment settled over the foyer. It was the sound of a closing bell. Miriam tried one last time to exert dominance. She marched toward me, her hand raised as if to strike. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I simply looked at her with the cold, analytical gaze I used for failing portfolios. She stopped inches from me, her hand trembling in the air. She saw something in my eyes that she hadn't expected, an absolute lack of empathy. I wasn't angry. I was finished. "Get out of my house, Miriam," I said. The police officers stepped forward, their hands resting on their belts. The physical dominance of the room shifted. Miriam's shoulders slumped. She turned and walked out the door, her heels clicking a hollow, defeated rhythm on the gravel. Elliot followed her, looking like a man who had suddenly aged 20 years. Paige was the last. She stood in the doorway, looking back at the luxury she had tried to steal. The villa was glowing with warmth, the scent of jasmine and expensive wine lingering in the air. She was looking at the life she could have had if she had simply been honest. "Where are we supposed to go?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The village has a hostel near the bus station," I said. "It's clean, it's functional, it's exactly what you can afford right now." I closed the heavy oak door. The sound was definitive. I turned the iron bolt, the metal sliding into place with a clunk that felt like the final period on a very long, very exhausting sentence. I was alone in the foyer. The silence of the villa was immediate and profound. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a library. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a vacuum. I walked back into the dining room. The table was still set for a feast that would never be finished. The candles had burned down, the wax dripping in grotesque frozen shapes onto the wood. I picked up a glass of water and drank it. My hands were perfectly steady. I went to my study and opened the laptop. There was work to be done. I filed for divorce through my firm's portal, the digital documents being dispatched to my attorneys in New York with a single click. I moved the remaining funds from our joint accounts into a restricted escrow, not to steal them, but to ensure they were handled according to the strict terms of the prenuptial agreement which they had now breached. I was being precise. I was being fair. I was being a machine. But as I sat there, the blue light of the screen reflecting in the dark windows, a small detail flickered in the back of my mind. It was something Miriam had said, a slip of the tongue during her final tirade. She had mentioned the timing of the police. But she hadn't called the police when she first noticed the brooch was missing. She had waited until the guests arrived. That was the theatrical move I expected. However, the police had arrived faster than a local village precinct should have. They had been prepared. I went back to the footage. I looked at the arrival of the police car. They hadn't come from the village. They had been parked at the end of the drive for 20 minutes before Miriam even made the accusation. My pulse didn't quicken, but my mind sharpened. Someone else had tipped them off. Someone else had been managing the timeline. I looked at the peripheral cameras, the ones covering the back entrance of the villa, the service door used by the staff. I scrubbed the footage back an hour. There, in the grainy infrared of the garden path, I saw a figure. It wasn't Paige or Miriam. It was Elliot. He was meeting a man in a dark suit. They spoke for less than a minute. Elliot handed over a small white envelope. Then, the man in the suit made a phone call. I zoomed in on the man's face. It wasn't a police officer. It was the private investigator I had hired months ago to look into the firm's leaks, the man I thought was working exclusively for me. The twist settled in my mind with a cold, logical weight. Elliot wasn't just a bumbling enabler. He was the double agent. He had been selling information to me about his own wife and daughter, while selling information to them about me, and likely selling both of us to Marcus Thorne. He had been playing all sides, ensuring that no matter who went down, he would have a soft landing. He had probably been the one to suggest the frame-up to Paige, knowing I would catch it. He wanted me to get rid of Miriam and Paige so he could settle his debts with the commission he earned from the wreckage. I leaned back in the chair, a dry, dark chuckle escaping my throat. The irony was perfect. I had been so focused on the obvious threats, the loud mother-in-law and the deceptive wife, that I had underestimated the man who had spent 40 years being invisible. I looked at the phone on my desk. I could call the police back. I could have Elliot intercepted. But that would be a messy, loud conclusion. That wasn't my style. I stayed in the villa, the master of a silent kingdom. I watched the moon climb higher over the sea, the silver light illuminating the jagged cliffs. I wasn't going to sleep. I was going to run the numbers again. Because if Elliot thought he was the one holding the final contract, he had forgotten the most important rule of the market. The house always wins, and tonight, I was the house. The morning after the expulsion was a study in clinical efficiency. While the Amalfi sun bleached the limestone cliffs to a blinding white, I remained in the shadowed interior of the villa's study, surrounded by the hum of cooling electronics. I did not feel the exhaustion one might expect after a night of psychological warfare. Instead, I felt a sharpened sense of purpose, the kind that comes when a complex trade finally enters its terminal phase. I spent the early hours reconstructing the architecture of Elliot's double cross. It was a fascinating piece of structural engineering. He had played the role of the submissive, browbeaten husband so effectively for decades that even I had factored him in as a negligible variable. I had seen him as a passenger in Miriam's vehicle, when in reality, he was the one quietly siphoning the fuel. I pulled up the digital trail of the private investigator, a man named Moretti. Moretti had been sending me reports for months, but as I cross-referenced the timestamps of his discoveries with the wire transfers from Elliot's shell company, the pattern emerged. Moretti wasn't just investigating the leaks. He was helping Elliot create them. They were feeding me enough truth to keep me focused on Paige and Miriam, ensuring I would eventually act to sever those ties, which would in turn trigger the very instability Marcus Thorne needed to move on my investors. It was a recursive loop of betrayal. Elliot wasn't just looking for a payout. He was looking for a total reset of his life, funded by the wreckage of mine. I spent 3 hours on a secure line with my compliance team in London. We didn't discuss emotions or the tragedy of a broken marriage. We spoke in the language of damage control and asset protection. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the counter-offensive was live. I initiated a clawback provision on every gift, trust, and allowance tied to the Clarke name, citing the breach of fiduciary duty evidenced by the footage of the frame-up. In the eyes of the law, the attempt to plant the brooch on my mother was more than a family spat. It was a criminal conspiracy to commit defamation and fraud. Next, I turned my attention to the social landscape. Miriam's power resided in her perceived status within the Greenwich and Manhattan elite. I didn't need to shout from the rooftops to destroy her. I simply needed to leak the right data to the right people. I sent a carefully redacted summary of the evening's events, including the police report and a link to the video of Paige and the brooch, to the 3 most influential social curators in our circle. I added no commentary. I let the images speak for themselves. In that world, an accusation of theft is a stain, but being caught in a clumsy, low-rent frame-up is an absolute social expiration. By dinner time in New York, the Clarke name would be a punchline. As for Marcus Thorne, I played a more delicate game. I didn't threaten him. I simply sent him a high-resolution screenshot of the wire transfers from his firm to Elliot's shell company. I attached a brief note. I've updated my risk assessment for the upcoming quarter. I suggest you do the same before the regulators receive the full ledger. Within 10 minutes, my phone buzzed with a notification. The wire transfers from Azzurro Holdings had stopped. Thorne was cutting his losses and burning the bridge. Elliot was now officially adrift. I stepped out of the study and found my parents in the garden. They were sitting by the lemon trees, their suitcases packed and waiting by the door. My father looked up, his face etched with a weary kind of relief. "The car is here for Sorrento, Garrett," he said. "Are you coming with us?" "No," I replied, adjusting my watch. "I have one final meeting to attend, a closing of accounts." "Garrett," my mother said, standing up and taking my hand. Her touch was warm, a sharp contrast to the cold glass and metal I'd been interacting with all morning. "Don't let this turn you into them. You've won. Just let them go." "I am letting them go, Mom," I said. "But in my business, you never leave a position open. You always hedge the exit." I watched them drive away in the Mercedes, their faces looking back at the villa with a mixture of awe and sadness. They were safe. They were out of the blast radius. Now I could finish the work. I had tracked the Clarkes to a small, dusty cafe near the bus station in the village. They hadn't gone to the hostel. Miriam's pride wouldn't allow it until every other option was exhausted. I watched them through the villa's remote-access street cameras. They looked like a trio of shipwreck survivors. Miriam was arguing with a waiter over the price of a coffee, while Paige sat staring at her phone, likely realizing that her accounts were frozen. Elliot sat apart from them, his briefcase still clutched in his lap, his eyes scanning the crowds for Moretti, a man who was never going to show up. I sent a text to Paige. It was the first communication I'd had with her since I bolted the door. "Meet me at the cliffside overlook. 5 o'clock. Just you and your parents. We need to sign the final separation papers if you want the stipend for your flights home." The bait was the stipend. I knew they were penniless in a foreign country. They would come. I arrived at the overlook early. It was the same stone platform where Miriam had first accused me of theft. The wind was stronger now, whipping the scent of salt and pine across the limestone. I stood at the edge, looking down at the white foam crashing against the rocks far below. The height didn't bother me. In fact, for the first time in years, I felt perfectly grounded. I heard the sound of their approach before I saw them. The clicking of Miriam's heels on the stone path was slower now, less confident. They rounded the corner and stopped 10 feet away. They looked disheveled. The heat and the stress had stripped away the last of their polished veneer. "You have the papers?" Miriam demanded, her voice rasping. She was trying to maintain her posture, but her eyes were darting around, looking for a trap. "I have something better," I said, pulling a leather folio from my jacket. "I have the realization of your current market value." "Garrett, please," Paige said, stepping forward. Her eyes were red, her skin sallow. "We can't stay in that village. It's humiliating. Just give us the money and let us go home. We'll sign whatever you want." "Home?" I asked. "Which home, Paige?" "The apartment in the city is owned by the firm. The house in Greenwich is currently being appraised for a forced sale to cover the missing funds from your joint accounts. You don't have a home to go back to. You have a series of liabilities." Elliot stepped forward, his face a pale mask. What about my arrangements, Garrett? I helped you. I gave you the footage you needed. I made sure the police were there. Miriam turned to her husband, her mouth falling open. What did you say? He's right, Miriam, I said, enjoying the moment of absolute internal combustion. Elliot was my most valuable asset. He's been reporting on your every move for months. He's the reason I knew about the brooch before it even left your jewelry box. He's the reason I knew about the meeting with Marcus Thorne. The look of betrayal that crossed Miriam's face was more visceral than anything I had ever seen on a trading floor. She looked at her husband as if he had suddenly morphed into a venomous insect. You sold us out? To him? He offered me a way out, Miriam, Elliot shouted, his voice cracking with years of suppressed resentment. You were going to ruin us with your vanity. You and Paige, with your constant demands, your obsession with a life we couldn't afford without his checkbook. I just wanted a quiet life. And you got it, Elliot? I interjected. A very quiet life. Because the arrangements you think you have with me are as empty as the shell company you used to hide Thorne's money. I've turned over the logs of our partnership to the authorities as well. You aren't a whistleblower, Elliot. You're a co-conspirator who tried to play both sides. And in a volatile market, the middle is the most dangerous place to be. The three of them stood there, a triptych of ruin. The wind howled around us, a cold, indifferent sound. They were finally seeing the full scope of the landscape I had built for them. There was no escape, no social standing to retreat to, and no loyalty left between them. You're a monster, Miriam whispered. No, I replied, closing the folio. I'm a manager. I've simply realigned the assets to reflect their true worth. You three are worth zero. In fact, you're a net negative. And tonight, I'm clearing the books. I took a step toward them, and for the first time, I saw genuine, unadulterated fear in their eyes. They didn't know what I was going to do. They had spent so long projecting their own malice onto me that they expected a physical strike, a violent outburst, but I wasn't going to give them that. I wasn't going to lower myself to their level of chaos. I've left 3 tickets for the evening ferry to Naples at the cafe, I said. From there, you're on your own. The stipend I mentioned is enough for 3 economy seats to New York. Not first class, not even business. You'll be sitting in the back of the plane with the people you've spent your lives looking down upon. I turned my back on them and walked toward the edge of the overlook. I looked out at the horizon, where the sea and sky merged into a single, infinite shade of blue. Garrett, Paige called out, her voice desperate. Is this it? Is this how you're leaving us? I'm not leaving you, I said, not looking back. I've already left. You're just now noticing the distance. I walked away, my footsteps firm on the stone. I didn't look back to see if they were following. I didn't look back to see if they were fighting amongst themselves. I had executed the plan. The position was closed. As I reached the villa's gates, I felt a sense of absolute, crystalline clarity. The house was mine. The silence was mine. The future, unburdened by the rot of their expectations, was mine. I had paid for paradise, and in the end, I was the only one left to inhabit it. The final hour of the Amalfi sun was a heavy, liquid gold that seemed to coat the villa in a layer of gilded amber. I stood on the highest balcony of the estate, a vantage point that allowed me to see the winding ribbon of the road leading down to the harbor. In the distance, the ferry to Naples was a white speck against the darkening blue of the sea. I checked my watch. It was time. I had left the gates unlocked. I knew they would return. Desperation is a predictable engine. It doesn't drive people toward new horizons. It pulls them back to the source of their frustration, hoping for a different outcome in a game that has already concluded. I heard the heavy thud of the oak door downstairs. It wasn't the sound of guests arriving. It was the sound of intruders reclaiming a space they no longer owned. I didn't go down to meet them. I waited in the atrium, sitting in a high-backed velvet chair that positioned me in the center of the marble floor, directly beneath the gaze of the stone statues that lined the upper gallery. The air was cool, smelling of the sea and the expensive floor wax. They entered as a pack, though the hierarchy had shifted. Miriam was in the lead, her face a frantic scramble of ruined makeup and sharp lines. Paige followed, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for something she'd forgotten to pack. Elliot was at the rear, his shoulders hunched, the briefcase he had clutched so tightly now gone, likely abandoned or taken as collateral by someone in the village. You're still here? Miriam said, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. I paid for the week, Miriam. I intend to see the lease through, I said. I didn't rise. I stayed seated, my hands resting calmly on the arms of the chair. We aren't taking the ferry, Paige said, stepping forward. She tried to summon a flicker of her old defiance, but it came out as a hollow tremor. You can't just throw us out like this. There are laws. There are standards. We have rights to the assets you've frozen. Rights are born from contracts, I replied. And you've spent the last 6 months systematically violating every contract we had. You didn't come back here for rights, Paige. You came back because the reality of the street is starting to sink in. You came back because you realize that without my signature, your name is just a collection of letters that no bank in Europe cares about. We'll go to the press, Miriam threatened, her hand trembling as she pointed at me. We'll tell them about the cameras. We'll tell them you're a monster who spied on his family in their most private moments. The footage you think is your shield will become your cage. No one will do business with a man who records his wife. I reached into the small leather folio on the side table and pulled out a single sheet of paper. This is a statement of service from the villa's management. It confirms that the security upgrades were requested by the tenant for the protection of high-value assets after a reported security breach, specifically the loss of a laptop 3 months ago. Everything is documented as a standard safety protocol. As for the content of the footage, I'm not the one on camera framing my own mother for a felony, Miriam. I'm just the man who looked at the data. I stood up then. The movement was slow, deliberate. I walked toward them, and they instinctively backed away, the space between us expanding as I reclaimed the floor. You think this is about a brooch, or a bank account, or a rival firm, I said, my voice dropping to a low, resonant frequency. But those are just the mechanics. This is about the fundamental misunderstanding of who I am. You thought I was the provider, the quiet, analytical man who worked late so you could have your charity galas and your designer caftans. You thought my restraint was a sign of weakness. You thought my preparation was just a quirk of the trade. I stopped 3 feet from Miriam. She was shorter than me, and without the armor of her social standing, she looked fragile, like an old bird caught in a storm. I don't lose, Miriam. Not because I'm lucky, and not because I'm cruel. I don't lose because I account for every possible failure before I ever step into the room. I accounted for your greed, I accounted for Paige's boredom, I even accounted for Elliot's cowardice. I turned to Elliot. He wouldn't look at me. He was staring at the floor, his breathing shallow. The envelope you gave Moretti? I asked. The one you thought was the final piece of evidence to sink me? It was a set of forged ledgers I planted in my desk specifically for you to find. Moretti didn't take them to the police. He took them to a contact of mine at the regulatory board. You didn't just fail to betray me, Elliot. You provided the evidence that proves you were attempting to manufacture fraud. You didn't just lose the game, you built your own prison. Elliot's knees buckled slightly, and he reached out to steady himself against a marble pillar. The silence that followed was absolute. The weight of their collective failure was a physical presence in the room, pressing down on them until the air felt thick and unbreathable. Garrett, please, Paige whispered. She was crying now, but there was no artifice in it. It was the raw, ugly sound of someone who has finally seen the bottom of the well. Don't do this. We can go back. We can fix it. I'll do whatever you want. I'll sign the papers. I'll go to a clinic. Just don't leave me with nothing. I looked at her, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of something. It wasn't pity, and it certainly wasn't love. It was the satisfaction of a completed calculation. The variable had been solved. I'm not leaving you with nothing, Paige, I said. I'm leaving you with exactly what you brought into this partnership. Yourself, no trust funds, no social safety net, no husband to absorb the shocks of the world for you. You wanted to be a player in the market? Welcome to the floor. I walked past them toward the grand entrance. I didn't grab a bag. I didn't need anything from this house. Everything I owned that mattered was already digital, encrypted, and moved to locations they would never find. I stopped at the door and looked back one last time. The 3 of them stood in the center of the atrium, surrounded by the luxury I had provided, looking like ghosts haunting their own lives. They were irrelevant. They were the noise I had finally filtered out of the signal. The ferry leaves in 20 minutes, I said. I've instructed the villa staff to call the authorities if you are still on the property by sunset, and since I've already settled the bill, the staff is very loyal to my instructions. Where are you going? Miriam asked, her voice small and broken. I'm going to find a new market, I said, one where the risks are more interesting. I walked out the door and into the evening air. The heat had broken, and a cool breeze was blowing in from the sea. I walked down the gravel path, the sound of my footsteps a steady, rhythmic beat against the silence of the cliffs. I reached the rented car parked outside the gates. I didn't look back at the villa. I didn't look back at the lights of the windows or the silhouettes of the people inside. I started the engine. The dashboard lit up, a familiar glow of data and possibilities. I put the car in gear and began the long, winding descent toward the coast. The road ahead was dark, illuminated only by the sharp, precise beams of my headlights, cutting through the shadows and revealing the path one turn at a time. I reached the bottom of the hill and turned toward the airport. I was done with Italy. I was done with the Clarks. I was done with the version of myself that needed to be understood. I adjusted the rearview mirror, but not to look at the villa. I adjusted it to see the road behind me, ensuring it was clear. The past was a closed position, a settled account, a line on a ledger that had been balanced to 0. I drove into the night, the engine humming a low, steady song of independence. I was alone, I was unburdened, and for the first time in my life, I was perfectly, ruthlessly free. I took a deep breath of the salt air. The calculation was complete.